She was carried to the torture chamber and told to tell the truth. When she said that she had nothing to say, she was ordered to be stripped and again admonished, but was silent. When stripped, she said, "Señors, I have done all that is said of me, and I bear false witness against myself, for I do not want to see myself in such trouble. Please God, I have done nothing." The tying of the arms commenced. She was told to tell the truth and replied, "I have told the truth and have nothing to tell." One cord was applied to the arms and twisted. Then she screamed and said, "I have done all they say." She was told to tell what she had done, for she was tortured because she had not done so, and another turn of the cord was ordered. That is an excerpt from the official records of the interrogation of Elvira Campo, conducted under torture. Her alleged offense was to have conducted Jewish religious practices in secret after a forced conversion to Catholicism. For this so-called crime, Elvira had fallen afoul of the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, better known as the Spanish Inquisition. From 1481 to 1834, this tribunal put on a trial up to 130,000 individuals accused of heresy, prohibited religious practices, witchcraft, and other offenses, cementing a reputation of fanaticism and intransigence. The methods of the Inquisition became sadly infamous, as thousands of defendants fell victim to torture or to death by burning. Most of what we know about the Inquisition, however, may be wrong, informed by assumptions and misconceptions. So, what is the truth about one of the darkest aspects of Spanish history? Popular perception of the Inquisition may conjure images of fanatical Spanish clergymen burning at the stake thousands of innocents unjustly accused of witchcraft. The truth is, the Inquisition was not born in Spain, and its initial goal was to fight organized heretical movements in southern France and northern Italy. In the 1170s, the papacy took note of a new Christian sect taking root in these areas, especially in the Languedoc region of southern France. These heretics, known as Cathars or Albigensians, were inspired by ancient Gnostic beliefs. In very simple terms, they believed that all matter was evil and humankind's aim was to free their spirit from their earthly shackles. More worryingly for the Catholic Church, Cathars refused established dogma and garnered a substantial following amongst the aristocracy in Languedoc. The conflicts between the Pope, the French crown, and the Cathars would lead to a full-blown conflict with a genocidal death toll, the Albigensian Crusade of 1209 to 1229. On a purely religious level, Pope Lucius III reacted by creating the Episcopal Inquisition in 1184, which in 1231 became the Pontifical Inquisition under Pope Gregory IX. During the Crusade, papal legates and inquisitors from the Dominican order frequently accompanied the troops in their campaigns against the Cathars and their allies, and there were instances in which the clergymen incited crusaders to slaughter all their enemies and burn at the stake the survivors. The main goal of the Inquisition, however, was to convert heretics back into the fold of Roman Catholicism. Violence was the last resort for those who still refused the Pope. After the end of the Crusade, however, the Inquisition took a more proactive role, seeking and rooting out the last remnants of Catholicism as well as other heretical movements. During this period, the activities of the Inquisitors expanded to Aragon, modern-day northern Spain, a kingdom which had previously sided with the pro-Cathar faction during the Crusade. On October 19, 1469, King Ferdinand II of Aragon married Queen Isabella of Castile, thus uniting the two most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula and laying the foundation for what is today Spain. The two monarchs still had to complete the centuries-long endeavor known as the Reconquista or Reconquest of Spain from the Muslim invasion back in 711 AD. As they gradually completed their southwards conquest, Ferdinand and Isabella set themselves the task of homogenizing a multicultural Iberian society in which Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and even Christian heretical sects cohabited. According to Spanish historian Henry Kamen, Spanish Catholic society at the time was widely accepting of other religions and beliefs. Those in power, however, not so much. In 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella requested and received a papal bull which allowed them to institute their local branch of the Inquisition. The first courts were established in 1481, and the first Inquisitor General of the Spanish Inquisition was appointed in 1483, the notorious Thomas de Torquemada. In the following decade, the monarchs completed the Reconquista, defeating the Islamic Kingdom of Granada in 1492. On March 31st of that year, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering that all Muslims and Jews should convert to Christianity or face exile. Thus, the main task of the Spanish Inquisition became to put under trial the conversos, or converted individuals suspected of practicing their old religions in secret. The Inquisition took to this objective with gusto. From 1483 to 1515, Torquemada and friends conducted a total of 5,700 trials. However, we should note that this flurry of activity seldom resulted in guilty sentences, let alone the death penalty. In fact, about 88% of the accused were found not guilty and were allowed to be reconciled with the Catholic Church. The remaining 12%, or about 700 individuals, did die at the stake. Colin McGarry at University College Cork, however, argues that this initial trialing frenzy was a means to protect converted Moors and Jews from extrajudicial mob violence, which could have exacted a much higher death toll had the Inquisition not intervened. Massacres of conversos did continue in Portugal, in fact, so much so that many of them fled to Spain seeking the protection of the Inquisition. The initial decades of the Inquisition saw its peak of anti-Jewish activities, but in the mid-16th century, the moriscos, or Muslim converts, became the main target. This was a consequence of two events. First, the rebellion of the Alpujarras, a Morisco uprising in 1568, then an economic recession which prompted Christians to grow resentful of the wealthy Morisco families. According to Henry Carman, from the 1570s in Aragon and Valencia, the Moors formed the bulk of the persecutions in the Inquisition. In the court of Granada itself, the Moors represented 82% of the accused between 1560 and 1571. The persecution culminated on April 9, 1609, when King Philip III issued a decree expelling all Moriscos from the peninsula. By 1613, some 300,000 Moriscos had been expelled from southern Spain and from Aragon, with certain cities such as Valencia losing up to a third of their population. In the light of these mass expulsions, the Inquisition can be considered a tool used by the Crown to enact a harsh policy of cultural and religious homogeneity. In its first 130 years of activity, the Inquisition had dealt decisively with its initial targets. Most Jews had now been successfully assimilated, while the Moors had been altogether expelled. Thus, in the following decades, the Spanish Inquisition differentiated its portfolio activities, targeting other offenses such as superstition, heresy, bigamy, insulting the Inquisition itself, Protestantism, and witchcraft. Now, about witchcraft. Let's get this out of the way, shall we? It may surprise you, but the Spanish Inquisition did not hammer down on witches as much as the rest of Europe, and surely less than the Protestant countries. The best-kept records regarding the trials of witches pertain to the regions of Catalonia and Valencia. From 1560 to 1600, the local tribunals tried fewer than 64 people accused of witchcraft in these areas. In the first decade of the 1600s, inquisitors recorded a spike of activities with a total of 72 cases. From 1610 to 1670, the courts maintained a steady rhythm of 54 tried witches per year, before figures dropped to an average of 4 per year. These records, however, don't capture the nature of the sentences. For that, we have to refer to a specific case which took place in Zugarramurdi in the Navarre region. In 1608, a local woman accused several villagers of being part of a witches' coven, congregating in a cave. The evidence? She had a dream about it. Inquisitor Juan Valle Alvarado came to investigate, initially charging more than 300 locals. Eventually, he brought to trial only 40 of them, of which 29 were declared guilty in June 1610. In November, they were subjected to an auto de fe, or an act of faith. These were public ceremonies held by the Inquisition, during which the sentences were read in front of a large crowd in a public square. The accused were then given the chance to repent and swear an oath to the Inquisition. If they refused, they'd be burnt at the stake. In this specific case, 18 of the accused confessed their sins and were forgiven. 6 resisted confession and were burned alive. The remaining 5, well, they'd already died in prison, so they were burned in effigy, meaning that statues bearing their likeness were thrown onto the flames. The case of Zugarramurdi is considered the harshest and bloodiest episode of how the Inquisition dealt with witchcraft in Spain. The majority of inquiries against this particular charge, however, had a far less dramatic outcome. A good example of this is the case of Juan Duran, a blacksmith tried in Barcelona in February 1653 by Inquisitors Bernardo Cortina and Domingo Abad y Huerta. According to the trial's official records, Duran had declared that, quote, he possessed a book containing a prayer of such efficacy that if it were thrown into a fire along with a crucifix, the book would be preserved and the crucifix consumed, and that, quoting again, he had a book worth 50 ducats, as by merely looking at it, he could cure any disease and even restore the dead to life. Moreover, witnesses believed that the cures he had performed, quoting again, have been executed by his diabolical arts and the league he has made with the devil. The inquisitors concluded that It is to be presumed that the said prisoner has uttered many other superstitious and blasphemous speeches and done many other things by the help of the devil with whom he holds a particular intimacy. So, we have charges of blasphemy, necromancy, magic healing, and consorting with the devil, which sounds quite serious in a religious tribunal. Cotton and About, however, meted out what appeared to be the standard sentence for the time. Duran had to attend the mass, quote, in the manner of a penitent and with the insignia of a necromancer. He should then perform an abjuration de levi, meaning the renunciation, under oath, of a heresy. Finally, Duran would be banished from his hometown of Manresa for 4 leagues roundabout during the space of 4 years. The cases of Zugaramurdi and Juan Duran provide a good glimpse into the methods enacted by inquisitors, which tended to be well codified into printed manuals and generally predictable. A popular Monty Python sketch taught us that nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. In reality, though, everybody was well aware of inquisitors coming to investigate or judge a new case. When they arrived at a town, they first presented their credentials to secular and religious authorities. Inquisitors then announced their presence to the population by attending mass during a feast day or other religious events. This step arguably nullified their chief weapon, at least according to Monty Python, quoting, "Surprise, surprise, and fear, fear, and surprise." Inquisitors then issued an Edict of Grace, which allowed a period of clemency. During this period, whoever stepped forward admitting their guilt would be pardoned and reconciled with the church without punishment nor trial. After the period of clemency had expired, the Inquisitors issued an Edict of Faith, which initiated the proper judiciary process, including investigations, interrogations, trial, and if needed, torture. We will cover torture in detail in another section today, but we're now going to look at other aspects of the inquisitorial process, starting with imprisonment. The accused individuals would often be jailed during the investigation and leading up to trial. The mention of Spanish Inquisition jails may conjure images of dire, damp, and dark dungeons. In reality, jail defendants enjoyed plenty of light and open air, and depending on the nature of the charges, could be allowed to walk freely during the day and then return at night. They were allowed to receive visitors and bring in their own possessions, such as food, mattresses, new clothes, or even luxury items. And even when defendants packed lightly, authorities provided them with regular meals, which included servings of wine and even chocolate. Overall, the jails managed by the Inquisition enjoyed much better conditions compared to other Spanish and European prisons at the time. This stint in jail was concluded when the tribunal issued a verdict. Contrary to popular belief, the Inquisition proved to be fairly balanced, issuing not guilty verdicts if evidence and testimonies did not prove culpability. If defendants were found guilty, in most cases the Inquisition allowed for them to be absolved and reconciled with the church if they repented. Depending on the nature and severity of the charges, defendants could endure harsh and humiliating tariffs nonetheless, such as being stripped to their waist and being whipped in public while mounted on a donkey, or paraded in front of the local populace during an auto da fe. The harshest possible sentence was, of course, death by burning at the stake. To that respect, the Spanish Inquisition has earned its grim reputation. The heat generated by the flames induced maddening amounts of pain in the victims, while organs and bodily tissue quickly shrunk due to the loss of fluids. When the nerve endings were completely burned, victims experienced a brief respite from the pain before smoke and hot gases caused their death by asphyxiation. This was a gruesome public spectacle designed to instill fear among onlookers and caution them from committing the same crimes as those being executed. Crimes which, let us not forget, nowadays would never be labeled as such. Now, popular perception has cemented the idea that the Spanish Inquisition may have burned at the stake tens of thousands of individuals, with figures ranging from between 30,000 and 100,000. First, we should clarify that the Inquisition technically never burned anybody. The Inquisitors would hand over the sentenced individuals to secular authorities, and it was up to them to carry out the execution. Second, the numbers are not nearly as high as those popularly quoted. Official records for the period from 1540 to 1700 show that the Inquisition conducted some 87,000 trials, of which 1,300 resulted in a death sentence, a total of about 0.015%. A similar analysis may be applied to another staple of inquisitional law, torture. Again, according to popular perception, the Spanish Inquisition may have subjected tens of thousands of individuals to elaborate and excruciating torture in order to extort confessions. But according to Ron Hassner, professor of political science at University of California, Berkeley, use of torture was far less frequent, indiscriminate, and arbitrary than one may expect. Professor Hassner reviewed detailed records from the Inquisition's tribunal in Toledo, dated 1575 to 1610. Based on these, Hassner concluded that torture was used on 12% of the defendants, of which less than one-third released a confession as consequence. The aim of Professor Hassner's research is not to exculpate the Inquisition from their sin of applying corporal punishment on defendants, but rather to show how tightly codified the use of torture was, both in its methods and its intended objectives. First, let's discuss those methods. Secular European tribunals at the time employed a wide array of torture implements and techniques. These were brutal and imaginative, ranging from whips to the application of hot bricks or hot irons to the groin to the use of contraptions to break victims' bones. In contrast, the Spanish Inquisition relied on only 3 forms of torture, considered to be the least harmful, relatively speaking, of course. These were the potro, the strapado, and the toca. The potro was a rack on which the victims were stretched by pulling a thick rope which was twisted around their arms and cut into their flesh. The strapado was a type of pulley which vertically suspended victims by their wrists, often resulting in dislocated limbs. Finally, the toca could be described as a type of waterboarding in which jars and jars of water were poured into a victim's mouth. Through the use of these torments, inquisitors did not expect victims to confess that they were actually Muslim, Jew, or heretics. The aim of torture sessions was to get victims to confess to observable practices which related to their religion, heresy, or crime. In other words, interrogators were not satisfied with victims screaming in pain, "Yes, I'm secretly a Jew and my conversion to Christianity was a sham." What they were after was an admission along the lines of, "It is true, I do not eat pork and I do not work on the Sabbat." So, why focus on these observable, external aspects of religious practices? Well, to begin with, inquisitors seldom used torture to extort a confession, which may have been false or inaccurate. They used torture instead to corroborate and interrogate existing evidence and testimonies, which also focused on observable practices rather than the opinions of the accusers. Facts and not beliefs, if you like. And in their quest to compete and corroborate testimonies focused on facts, often inquisitors went as far as torturing witnesses in the trial, and not just the defendants. One aspect to clarify is who decided if a witness or defendant was to undergo torture. This decision was actually put to the vote of the consulate, a body which included the inquisitors as well as local clergy and judicial authorities. Only if the consulta voted 100% in favor, the victim would be led to the torture chamber. Even so, the victim had the right to appeal to the Supreme Court of the Inquisition, which may rule against the consulta. But even if this body voted in favor, the accused were given several warnings, giving them opportunity to provide their statement without undergoing torture. If this step failed, they would be led to the torture chamber. Local executioners were enlisted as torturers, while inquisitors posed the questions. A representative of the local bishop and a doctor always had to be present, and then the torment started, briefly interrupted after each twist of the rope or jar of water shoved down the throat. The inquisitors then questioned the victims, simply encouraging them to tell the truth and completely avoiding leading questions, a method which prevented victims from blindly confessing to whatever accusation was thrown at them. If the victims remained silent or refused to cooperate, the torture escalated. However painful, these sessions rarely lasted long and were cut short if the inquisitors found them non-productive, if the victims offered the information deemed as satisfactory, or if they remained silent throughout. In this latter case, the trial would end with a not guilty verdict or with a very lenient sentence. And even when the defendant confessed under torture, they had the opportunity to recant said confession 1 or 2 days later. Now, there is a risk that the torments could resume, but this was rarely the case, as the formal regulations of the Inquisition prohibited torturing an individual more than once. The Spanish Inquisition was definitively abolished in July 1834. Throughout its almost 4 centuries in existence, it prosecuted converted Muslims and Jews, heretics, Protestants, witches, and other categories. And it did torture and kill individuals on the basis of allegations which would be laughed off in any modern European court. Their torture rates and death tolls, however, are not nearly as high as commonly perceived. Even the practices of Inquisition tribunals were better codified, more rational, and often more lenient than their secular counterparts, both in Spain and abroad. Such an institution definitely deserves its grim reputation. However, its dark legacy does appear to be exaggerated compared to the misdeeds of other European judicial institutions of the time. According to historians such as Harry Carman and Henry Charles Lee, this dark legacy is largely the result of the Black Black Legend. Sensationalistic, anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic propaganda spread as early as the 16th century. In the second half of the century, King Philip II was tied up in a protracted war against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and their main supporter, Elizabethan England. It was these enemies of Spain who spread exaggerated tales of the terrors brought about by the Inquisition, inciting other European populations to resist or rebel against Spanish military occupation. The message was clear: fight against Philip II, lest he exports his Inquisition to your country. The origin of the Black Legend, however, appears to be homegrown, namely political exile Antonio Perez, the scheming secretary of King Philip, who defected to England in November 1591 fearing execution. Perez's legend was so convincing that it planted roots amidst European collective consciousnesses. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment intellectual movement dealt another propaganda blow against the Spanish Inquisition, perceived and portrayed as the epitome of religious persecution and backward superstition. Curiously, also, this second wave of Black Legend discourse was propped up by a defecting secretary, Juan Antonio Lorente, former secretary to the Inquisition in Madrid. The third wave, which cemented the current image of the Spanish Inquisition, was unleashed by English and American historians in the 1820s. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish colonies in South America had gained independence. When the Bonaparte menace had been dealt with in Europe, Spain had plans to reconquer its American possessions. This threat prompted Anglophone authors to circulate narratives about the excesses and intolerance of the Inquisition, thus inciting the newly independent South American countries to resist a counter-revolution, which actually never took place. According to Jack Ortiz, University of North Florida, writing for the Osprey Journal of Ideas and Inquiry, quote, "Pre-1960s, scholars misconstrued the facts. When they looked at the Inquisition records, they only focused on the cases that resulted in the bankruptcy or execution of convicted heretics. They neglected to mention the less severe and more prevalent penalties handed down by the Inquisition. Nor did they mention instances in which inquisitors spoke out against the discrimination and violence plaguing Spanish society." It was up to post-1960 scholars to provide a more rounded and accurate view of the Spanish Inquisition. One of the most prolific authors, the already quoted Henry Carman, argues that the overall death rate of the Inquisition was less than 2%, a total of 2,600 people. Carman further demonstrated that the Inquisition never held an iron grip over the Spanish population for a very simple reason. At any one time, there were about 30 to 40 active inquisitors in Spain, supported by some 400 subordinates. Surely, this scant force could not be omnipresent, but was rather distributed in major urban centers. Carman and other revisionist historians have thus contributed to downsizing the heavy shadow cast by the Holy Office of the Inquisition. They also highlighted how its methods were not uniquely cruel or intolerant for the time and were comparable to those used by tribunals in other European countries. But even after removing the filter of the Black Legend, even revisionist authors must acknowledge that the Holy Office was once one of the darkest institutions in Spanish history. It may have tortured or burned fewer defendants than it was once credited for, and it may have been less brutal than its counterparts, but nonetheless, the Inquisition was responsible for hundreds of unjust deaths and traumatic injuries inflicted upon innocent individuals. Moreover, as a tool for the Spanish crown's policies in the 16th and 17th centuries, it contributed to the expulsion of tens of thousands of previously well-integrated Muslims and Jews.